just have a discussion like you and I had together, really,
Okay.
about things that have interest to you and what you do with your your business, as well as I just think what your personal passion is, which is very cool. So, and then if you've got things that you want to show, Mark's got your website, and if you've got anything else, Mark can handle all of that for us. And then Mark will also be screening questions that people have. I will tell you, we have one person in our audience, and she already has weighed in. That is awesome in terms of just putting comments and things in, but she knows that we're not going to respond necessarily as they're coming. So and that but she'll put lots of things in there, so don't worry about it. It might flash across your screen. Seems like every time I go on Zoom, they've changed something, and so
Mhm.
the way that they do things. So anyway, um, are things going well with you in your life?
Yeah, everyone's healthy. That's important.
Good. That's important. That's always good. Well, I think we are at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead, Mark. If you haven't made it live, go ahead and do it, and then I'll just introduce it.
Yes, we're live.
All right. Well, hey, everybody, welcome. And we are excited today to have Tomas here with us. And he and I have met on another conversation where we just decided it'd be great if he'd be able to come on with us. I also have to share, because I think a lot of you are going to enjoy this and wish you were here. Out of nowhere, I learned that a speaker that a lot of you will know about is going to be in Boise. So I'm going to be going to hear him speak tonight. And that's Joel Salatin. And Joel is sort of, and Tomas, maybe a name you do or don't know, but is sort of an icon, a feature. Maybe they'd call him the goat of some of the things that he does in life in the regenerative farming space. He's from Washington, D.C. area, and he speaks all over the world. And just to give you, this doesn't mean anything other than his speaking price rate is so high that if you don't fill an auditorium, I don't know whoever brings him in can even afford to have him. So he's going to speak at a civic center here in the part of the country I'm in, where I'm guessing there'll be 1,000 people or more that'll be listening to him tonight. But he's really very good, so I'm excited about that. So I'm going to go visit with him this evening. So anyway, Tomas, tell us a little bit about you, just your background. Oh, by the way, Mark is behind the glass, everybody. He'll take your questions as you put them out there for us. And somebody also, one in the audience, has already said, yeah, Joel Salatin is Polyface Farms, and that's what his farm name is. And so, Mark, why don't you just say hi, and then Tomas, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey everybody, and hello, Thomas. Welcome to our webinar.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Wayne. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and joining our network. I'm speaking from New York City, so pretty far away from you. It's interesting you're mentioning someone that is often referred to as a goat. I hear it increasingly often. And whatever I do, I'm not a goat, but probably I'm not a sheep either. And funnily enough, in Chinese language, it's the same word. Yang means either goat or sheep.
Uh,
So I'm gonna say one or two things more about China today because that's a topic of my recent book, and it was sort of the beginning of our conversation with Wayne. That's the Mineral War. That's a book about why we're having this problem with critical minerals. Why are we so exposed to Chinese monopoly and what it potentially means for all of us? That's the discussion. But my day job is running a fund here in New York City where I invest in equity of mining and metals companies that are trying to help us rebuild this industry and further industry downstream as well, and become a little less dependent on the monopoly designs of other powers around the world. So that's the real story.
cool. Mark's going to pull up Tomas's website for his fund in a little bit, but and then also we'll talk more about his book as we as we move along. But it, we here in the States, I think, a little bit more. By the way, our audience is all over the world, so that's why I'll define kind of the States a little, about the Chinese being very impactful on agriculture and buying farms, for example, getting more of a presence than maybe we would want or like them to have. And is it do you think a planned process to have more and more influence over us by having presence in a variety of these very important industries?
It's a good question. It's probably not one linear answer to this. It could be both things. It could be actually a fortuitous development or with confluence of many factors, and also an ideological bent to view the world through the lens of survival and struggle and conflict. On that second thread, I just published something on LinkedIn today, thinking about the 1999 book by two colonels of People's Liberation Army, which is the armed forces of the PRC. Their name was Chao Yang and Wang Sui. And they actually invented this term unrestricted warfare. Unrestricted warfare is not a warfare that's just kinetic with lethal tools, but it's across different domains, both military and civilian. And that includes markets, and that includes lawfare, so legal warfare, and that includes economic, financial, cyber, influence operations, cognitive influences, such as TikTok, for example, in the case of our country, where it's sort of a broad-based approach to struggle against the goals. I do pay attention to this because at least since 2013, which is 14 years after that initial treaties published in China, the leadership of the People's Republic, especially Xi Jinping, head of the Chinese Communist Party, defined the West as an adversary. Our values, our institutions, our way of life as an existential threat to the survival of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, there are so many different facets to that. And of course, I just deal with one specific one because that's the market that I know, critical minerals. But of course, you're right, agriculture is another one. Of course, media operations is another one. Spreading corruption around the world, diplomatic approach in the so-called global South, turning the world against America and the West on a daily basis, massive expansion of the military power and navy, probes into the outer space, cooperation with Russia, you name it. It's just basically unrestricted warfare, as they call it themselves.
And yeah, heard you, as you were using the term lawware, instead of just warfare, so using law and all the other, so you could call it agriculture or mineral. Where was that mine, by the way, that's on the website that it looks big, open pitish? Where was that in the world?
I actually missed that. I don't know which one it was. We change occasionally these images.
Mark will show again here.
I know that some.
There we go. Here it is. Here it is.
Not sure really. Not sure. No, I cannot really tell you where it is. We have a couple of images from the major copper mine in Utah. We have Mount Weld, which is a rare earth mine in Australia, very important for the rare earth sector. I cannot tell you exactly where this one is, although the forest on top would tell me that maybe that's somewhere in Canada.
And how have we changed mining practices over the last, let's say, 30 years in terms of maybe learning from environmental negative practices at things like the Butte mine, for example? Or what do you see different? Are we protecting resources outside of the boundary of the pit itself?
So you see that this is an industry that will never be benign. It will always be somewhat damaging to the environment during the operations. I mean, you see those images. They're not necessarily pretty. The problem is we need those metals no matter what, right? And there's no
Yeah.
other way to get it other than through open pit or underground operation. Of course, underground operation has a completely different footprint on the surface. However, once the mines are exhausted, because these are wasting assets, there are ways to actually bring this environment back to normal. There are ways to do this, with geomembranes, flooding certain areas, reforesting, and so on. I've seen this done very well. But you refer to a disaster, specific disaster, and there's unfortunately a whole list of those. They mostly refer to either heap leach operations or tailings dams bursting and flooding. Happened twice in Brazil with dramatic effect in the last, say, 10 years or so, killing people. So this is the legacy of old mining, often of mines that were closed, a long time before. We have certain changes to the weather pattern. Some people, believe it's a massive shift in climate that affects the way in which a certain environment was put back to work after the mining operation ceased. And so it is a constant challenge. International rules on how to do these things, especially the closure of the mines, have been tightened in light of those disasters. And I'd say that at least the Western companies, publicly listed companies that have a lot of pressure from shareholders and other stakeholders and have to constantly pay attention to the local communities and, of course, environmental damage or negative externalities, have improved their ways in the last, say, 25 years. But there are some other players, private, from countries that maybe don't really live up or do not seek to live up to these sort of standards, not just necessarily Chinese, just from other places, other countries that we are sort of newer to this space, and they believe they have to skin the cat really quickly. That is never really sustainable in the longer term, that they will have to learn as well how to do it properly.
Picture marks on here now. Where's this one at,
North America again, I'd say.
It's
But
beautiful.
yeah.
That's a neat picture. It's interesting because from a farming perspective, which is my background, there's different ways that the contours are done in every one of these little hills here. And then the middle one, it's done in a way that is most land conserving, going parallel to the to sort of the grade. And then the other two look like they were done the opposite way. So we still in years are learning things in the whole farming arena, just as I'm sure we are in the resource development. Here we go, we're seeing something that's becoming more and more present around the world and is still controversial in some cases
yeah, it's interesting about that controversy. I kind of look at it from the perspective of my sector. So those direct drives that are in the engines of the windmills, especially those offshore, are huge sources of demand for specific magnets, rare earth magnets. So neodymium, praseodymium, mixed with boron and iron, and sometimes doped with other rare earths if they have to perform in high temperatures. So they are probably the single largest sources of demand for that product, which is being constrained by China. And I often question whether a crusade against those windmills, which almost remind me of Cervantes and Don Quixote, who was also fighting against windmills, if it's not related to a completely different problem, not a problem of visual impact or generally just questionable quality of some of these installations, but it's about saving those constrained resources for other uses. And of course, dual uses, especially military uses of sort of instantaneous need. But who knows? This is one of those discussions in DC that have prevented progress in many other areas, not least the permitting reform. So I can't wait for these battles to be over.
How, in a broad sense, how'd you become interested in this topic in the first place? So take us back in your career.
Yeah, so it's sort of a career started with a dual track. I lived in Asia as a young person, and then the first company where I worked on, of course, put me on the Asian desk and sent me to China, and so I developed some interest in how the communist system functions. And then they changed the matrix, and the matrix became industrial and threw me at mining industry, about which I knew absolutely nothing. And so I started learning quickly about geology and metallurgy and so on. I ended up working for a mining company. So that was the real school in South Africa, working for what used to be the world's largest gold company at that time. So sort of mining became my main professional focus, and became chartered financial analyst, and just moved to financing and investing in mining. And for many years, this was just any commodity, gold and copper and iron ore and many others. Until about 10 years ago, I spotted this phenomenon of critical minerals, and it started really with battery materials. This is the first time we heard about, electric vehicles. About 10 years ago, it became a big topic. And I noticed that this space is not entirely correlated with the other commodities. It's important in investment to find something that reduces the correlation of otherwise a directional fund, and decided to pay more attention to it, and it was quite successful. And then when COVID kicked in, all these funds were closed, and I was wondering what to do next. And I saw that legislation introduced by China that sort of prefigured the subsequent restrictions on exports of these materials. And I thought that's a fantastic opportunity. We have here investment opportunity. We have here a subsector that is constrained on a supply by a monopolist, and at the same time, it relates to mining and metals, which is my area of expertise after 20 years of working in that sector. So I decided just to launch a fund that would just match the two, that is investing in those materials, but outside of the Chinese value chain. And that's what I've been doing the last 4 years.
Oh, and the partners you have, were you guys all sort of already knew each other? How many people that of the group that we showed when Mark was showing your other senior leaders, did you guys know each other, or is it new relationships?
So it's a funny thing. So I live in New York City, and another guy living in New York City bumps into me in Ravensthorpe. Now, guess where it is? It's in southern part of Western Australia, at a lithium mine. And he says to me, "Oh, I know your name." And so that's the guy on the right hand side here of that, Stuart McIver. He's a third generation mining guy from Australia, but he lives here in New York City. So we met, whatever it was, 11, 12 years ago in Australia by accident, and started thinking about building something together. So when COVID kicked in, with him and Gabe, who's originally from Florida, and he just developed this connection to the Canadian side. So we have the Australian and Canadian side, which are very important because these are the ultimate sources of knowledge about new mining projects. A lot of things happen in Perth, Australia, and Vancouver, Canada. And so in the United States, we're kind of a uniquely positioned entity, which has both the broker dealer on one side of the business, and then on the other side, it's my fund, Amvest Terra Den. So just quickly, Terra, of course, is the earth. Den in Japanese means electricity, or Dian in Chinese and Mandarin. So it's electricity from the ground. So that's the idea of the name for that particular element. The entire group is currently here in the office about 10 people plus some collaborators. So we're still in a growth mode.
Well, what as you look at minerals in general and their locations around the world and the way that they're mined, and then in this case the ownership situation of who ends up with the resources once they're out of the ground, or any one of those points ones that are controlled more in this monopolistic manner that you're describing, that we should be worried about?
So Wayne, I tend to dissociate two things. One is monopolization, and the other one is weaponization. Monopolies in commodities are not that uncommon. I tend to equip that when God decided where to put geology on this planet, he did not consult humans who were planning borders between nations. And therefore, you can have accumulation of certain wealth in a specific country just by nature. So what are the other countries supposed to do? Invade it? Well, that Putin does it, right? But for the rest of us, it's usually trade. I'll give you an example. When I worked in South Africa, platinum, right? Platinum, which was so important for catalytic converters for, last 40 years, essentially 90 something percent productions out of South Africa. Never a problem for anybody because South Africa was willing to sell it. And it's a globally traded liquid precious metal. Another example, maybe most of us don't think about it, but very important for super alloys. It's niobium. It's also a metal. It's really controlled almost entirely by Brazil. 2 mines in Brazil, 1 smaller operation in Canada. Essentially just 3 sources of niobium for the entire world. Not a problem. And that one of those mines in Brazil have been going on for decades. It's a very significant source of that material. The United States in 1960s controlled almost the entire production of rare earths for the world. We, the United States, did. I grew up in Europe, and I remember my first color TV, which was a Sony, so a Japanese color TV, which had those very vibrant reds. Those vibrant reds were thanks to one rare earth element called europium, which was mined in California from Mountain Pass, the famed or sometimes infamous mine in California. It was never a problem. The Japanese could create a very successful product using American rare earths. Today, however, we're in a different situation when a monopoly is being abused as a source of unrestricted warfare. It's being weaponized, and it's a different story. It's a completely different story. The thing, for one, we have actually only one precedent, and that would be 1973 oil embargo by the OPEC countries. Now, that, of course, transformed not only our economies, energy efficiency, that, we're no longer really driving just 13 miles in a gallon, but twice as much. But also it led to the beginning of the petrodollar system around the world. So it changed our financial system. A friend of mine here from Columbia University, a professor there, actually compares the two events. So the OPEC embargo of 73 and the current choke point imposed by China, saying that the first one was like a car accident. It just crashed, and we have to immediately respond to this, everybody at the, at the pump. Whereas this is more like a cancer. And too often in different economies and different jurisdictions, people either don't want to be aware of that, what it potentially means for our downstream remaining industry, are trying to avoid the system or even lobby against any stronger measures in order not to upset the source of the trickle of the material that is still available, that is the Chinese Communist Party. So that's the difference, but I think that's a kind of a good comparison to what happened back in 1973. The situation is just as dramatic.
What is what's the biggest fear that this weaponization that we should have? What should we be paying the most attention to, or is there a variety of things?
Yeah, there's a variety of things, but we saw this for the flash last year, when China actually tightened the outflow of specific rare earth elements on 2 occasions. Once in April, supposedly in reaction to the Liberation Day tariffs. However, when the Liberation Day tariffs were considered illegal by the Supreme Court, China did not withdraw their own restriction. And then for the second time, they escalated in October of last year ahead of the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump. What that meant downstream, let's say for car makers, is that within a month, they wouldn't be able to produce any cars anymore, because you need those elements, those magnets for any electric motor. And about 48% of electricity that we use overall requires those electric motors. So the circular actuators. There are other actuators, they also need those, but that's what it would mean. Basically, the remaining industry in the West would stop functioning. Since the beginning of this year, China has slapped an embargo on Japanese producers, And it's extremely difficult right now here in the Japanese industry to continue functioning without that inflow of these materials. Now, the reason why China imposed those restrictions on the US was to prevent any further trade negotiations, which the first Trump administration kickstarted, trying to rebalance the very lopsided trade relations with China. The reason why China is slapping restrictions on Japan is related to their claims in the Western Pacific regarding different islands there, East China Sea, Taiwan, of course, South China Sea, and so on. So there are different reasons to do this, and it's a very powerful source of leverage. Just to quantify it, the entire rare earth oxide business is only about $6 billion. So basically as much as your personal wealth, I suppose. But the downstream impact of not having these materials, both in magnets and optoelectronics and so on, is about $10 trillion worth of lost value if we cannot obtain them. $10 trillion is a significant chunk of the global economy. It's like 8% of the global GDP. So a very, very significant impact here.
And how is this current administration, this current leadership in the US, and then even more allies dealing with this?
B plus, I'd say.
Mhm.
So a lot of momentum, a lot of focus on it. Quick learning over the last, say, whatever it is, 14 months, 15 months. Give big credit for that. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of taxpayers' money going into this space, which is, by comparison to some of the allies that do not have that capacity to act quickly with capital infusion, I think US is doing better. However, at the same time, we have redefined alliances on different levels. And while in this particular case, there is a common ground with both of our European and Asian allies, I think there's some caution on the other side whether they can actually trust the United States when we put, say, floor price or tariffs and so on, because there are so many other changing parts in those relationships. And that's probably is slowing down the progress for us to rebuild those value chains together. Case in point, Canada. Our relations with Canada are not great right now, and yet it's a neighbor with a significant mining industry and smelting industry that has been protected a little better from that globalized dispersal than the U.S. smelting industry over the last, say, 25 years or 30 years. And yet, we have not yet reached an agreement really with Canada on that on that in that sphere. So yes, there is, I think a lot of countries, and I was recently in Europe at a conference, rare earth conference, and a lot of people look up to US with a little bit of envy that we can actually move so quickly. And there is no doubt there is momentum. There's a lot of money going into those companies. Some of these companies also purchasing assets around the world. Just yesterday, an important US uranium and rare earth company purchased a very, very significant German magnet maker, which has one operation here in South Carolina as well. And so, yes, there's momentum, but sometimes in addition to, stepping down a momentum, you need to be careful, which direction you're going. And some of the movements are not just by me directly, personally, but from the market perspective, they're kind of, there are question marks why specifically this company is being favored or not another one, and so on. Maybe that's the approach, maybe that's the right approach. We will see, history will judge. There's very little time, and I always repeat that we're not in charge of this calendar. Mr. Xi Jinping is in charge of this calendar, and he will decide when to cut off or not the remaining trickle of the material that's still available to the West.
How about not yet discovered? Is that still, are we developing discovery technologies over time that maybe will allow us to find? I'm dealing with a personal situation that literally I just got a text that I was glancing at. I'm drilling a water well in a place where absolutely right now the drillers are at 800 feet in depth, and where there's wells all around the area where there was water found at 400 to 500 feet. we had a witcher who's considered sort of this magician type person to do water finding, that was out at the site before we started any of our drilling at all, and said, this is no problem at all. There's 4 or 5 different locations here you can find water. Well, we haven't, we're now at almost the limit that we want to go to, just from a cost perspective, for this water, and haven't found it. But on the other side of the coin, I know there are discoveries that occur all the time that are the opposite, where you find something where your geology would tell you maybe it would be, but no one's found it yet. Is that still out there, or are we?
Yeah, it's definitely possible to find newer areas. Again, the timeline from a discovery to a really operating mine in the West, at least for base metals, is like 15 years. So the question is, do we have those 15 years?
Right.
That's why I think, one of the things that our government has done well is just plowing money into alternatives, so sort of low-hanging fruits. So some research that goes into reusing the existing material that's already above ground. Some of them are tailings, for example, of old mine. Let's say if the mine was mined for niobium, but it has rare earths in the tailings, that's fairly straightforward to recover. And we are under time pressure to solve that problem. In terms of geology, and unfortunately, compared to water, it's more complex. There's about 120 elements in inorganic part of the table of elements that are of interest to us, of which some 40 are critical. And often I was just in Europe visiting 2 restart projects, so areas which used to be underground mines historically, one in northern Portugal, one in Macedonia, which was part of Yugoslavia historically. And it's really interesting. You would assume that this is the low-hanging fruit. You don't have to start drilling and discover something. It's there. And indeed, probably if it advances, gets financing, it will progress faster than a greenfields project. However, sometimes the headache is the actual wealth of that deposit. One of these deposits has a lot of other metals associated with the main metal of choice. In one case it was tungsten, and the other one was antimony. And unfortunately, it's a distraction for, but you know what? We don't have time. This is not a science project. This is business. So let's just go ahead and do the right thing. That takes a lot of management too.
How are we doing? Let's stay on the attitude you just described a little bit. How are we doing in our education right now of young geologists? Are we producing enough of those?
This is a catastrophe. Honestly, if you co-inspired to kill an industry over 3.5 or 4 decades, which is really what happened, then don't be surprised that young people are not interested in this. And that's not unique. This is not a unique problem to US. Even those par excellence mining countries like Australia and Canada, our allies, are suffering from the same penury of talent going into those schools. So it is a serious problem because they have more viable mining industries and many companies. There's just not enough people to man them. Not now, but say in 5 years from now, as the older folks like me retire. So this is an issue. Where I am actually encouraged, what I'm encouraged by is not so much something that's mining specific, but the fact that AI is killing a lot of pure, simple manipulating jobs, right? Sitting in front of a screen and typing something. That's going to be taken away. So why going to, college and studying, something that just simply is in sort of a 2-dimensional thing if you can learn how to make something in 3D? It could be a most advanced widget, like Taiwan makes the most advanced semiconductors, but it's still a 3D production of something. Or it could be digging a rock and transforming into something valuable. And so I think the next generation, the people who are, are in high school now, will have to really scratch their heads. What are they going to do? Are they going to go into a sector that's going to be completely decimated by AI? AI is not going to immediately create all these widgets. We will need robots with arms, with actuators. And by the way, we'll need rare earths for the magnets to go into those actuators in those robots. So for anything that's actually needs to be made, that's, I think, a safer bet for young people to go into than to just, cogitate about the abstract, more abstract things that can be now done by robots much more easily. So maybe by nature, this will push people into the opportunity, and the opportunity will be there because the money will slowly start moving into these areas. It will have to. So jobs will be available as well.
I've spent time and lived for a lot of my adult life in two states, South Dakota and Colorado, where it used to be the best and the brightest would go to Colorado School of Mines or to South Dakota School of Mines. I think I might be hearing a little bit that that's not the case any longer. And I know that the attraction 20 years ago, 30 years ago for those students was oil and gas. I mean, obviously the thought that that was the industry that they could then end up in and have a very, a great livelihood through what they had a passion in. Then associated with that, you go on those campuses 5 years ago, and the vast majority of the students you would have seen would have at least physically looked as if they were of Asian descent. So, is that still the case? I mean, are we educating a bunch of Chinese still in this country, or do they have enough? They got good enough schools of mines now in China that they don't need our education any longer?
They definitely have very good schools right now, and they're very well staffed to deal with these critical mineral sectors. I hear of thousands, tens of thousands of graduates coming out. But they may be actually killing their own industry by not allowing companies to export their product, right? So is this going to be really a career of choice? I call it mineral war. This is the title of my book. Today, if you're a Chinese engineer working, say, in rare earth industry, you may have a lot of things to do, but one thing you won't have is a passport. You won't be allowed to travel. Because one thing that communists believe in is that the means of production or ownership of means of production, control of means of production, determines the relations of production. That is the foundational structure of our society. And since they have accumulated all this capital park, they are very unlikely to share it. And I think that's the naivete, say, in Brussels, European Union believes, okay, we shared with you so much technology over the last 30 years by investing and deploying this Western technology with you. Now it's time for you to bring it to us, the battery technology and so on. Illegal by the rate of the Chinese Communist Party. So just very different approach. Now, I wouldn't racially stigmatize people studying in this country because we have so many Americans of Asian origin. So I don't know what the visual impact is right now. You know what? If any Americans or any allied students want to help us rebuild this industry, no matter whether a color, gender, or whatever, please, I'd love to this industry to be rejuvenated. But stealing technology is a different matter.
Right. Yeah, like I said, the best and the brightest used to be the ones that would be going to those places from the U.S. high schools and such. So, what are some other things that you would just like to point out that we should be thinking about in our audience and people who are just living day to day but they're technology savvy. It may not be in the minerals side of things, but what else should we be? What can we do? Maybe that also.
Yeah, so first we should be very concerned. I mean, everybody uses devices such as the ones for which we are connected right now, right? If you use a smartphone every day, you swipe, you touch indium tin oxide, right? That's a mineral which is connected with 60 other minerals inside that little device. And so it's important that we are able to control how these devices are made, because sooner or later, with the digital revolution, now the AI revolution, whoever controls these devices will end up controlling our minds. We don't want that. We don't want that. It's really important not to miss this mineral moment of the digital transformation or AI transformation as such, because these robots, they're a soul. It's not organic, it's inorganic, and it's made of these materials. So it's so important not to relinquish whatever control we may still have over those supply chains.
And again, I mentioned this lady as we started. Alicia is one of our really amazing, very loyal watchers and interacting with us. And she just made a question here, had a question. And she says, rather than attempting to own the entire global economy, China's primary strategy seems to be to make other nations highly dependent on Chinese goods and investments. Is that similar to your thoughts, or is that the approach?
Spot on. That means that Alicia reads Xi Jinping every day, or at least knows exactly what he thinks. And we know what he thinks because he introduced this dogma of Shuang Xunhuan, dual circulation. In this system, you render other countries completely dependent on the Chinese market, and you make China independent of the outside world. If you look at the trade balances of the Chinese economy with other partners, it is only negative when China has to import commodities that it just doesn't have in its subsoil, and therefore it runs a deficit with those countries, and occasionally with countries which are technologically superior. That's the case, for example, of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. China runs a current account deficit with those countries because it needs that technology. Other than that, the import substitution effort has been just massive and multi-layered. And I explain it partly in my book. Part of that is related to the tax system, which is anything in a Marxist economy focusing on production, not on consumption, right? They don't trust consumers. There's too many of them. You cannot control them. So the resources always go to production because it's easier to have the red line and, constrain a director in a mine or a factory than a plethora of consumers. So there's a structural problem there, of course, of overproduction and insufficient consumption. For an economy that's 17% of global GDP, this is everybody's problem, not just ours in America. It's a problem for Brazil, for Turkey, for Thailand, for Africa, for everyone. And so we will have more and more frictions. And China, obviously the CCP has decided not to rebalance its economy, just redirecting this momentum away from US, which has pushed back a little bit, away from Europe maybe, which is also pushing back. But then, of course, it's invading with its cheap product other countries, as Alicia says, making them dependent. But that's by design.
Here's another really good one. Another one of our really excellent long-term watchers. Robert says, if we're looking for exchange-traded funds, ETFs, that focus on the Chinese stock market, particularly those tracking indices related to mining and natural resources, where might be our best focus?
So I hear two questions here. One is Chinese and one is the critical minerals.
Yeah.
The popular Chinese ETFs are those that deal with technology stocks in China, KBW and so on. On the mining side, on critical minerals side, for a long time, there is one which we have used as a benchmark called REMX. So it's critical minerals, everything from battery materials, rare earths, specialty metals, equities. However, they include Chinese companies, and they include companies that do business with China. So there's a mix of Western and Chinese. It's not exclusively Western. There's a new product by Sprott, Canadian Sprott, which only started, I think, late March or early April, which exclude the Chinese companies. I don't remember the ticker, but I'm sure it's easy to Google that. Just Gemini that now, right? Just to type that, Sprott, SPROTT, ETF, critical minerals, ex-China, right? Of course, we run a fund like this, but I'm not allowed to promote a fund to a broader audience. So this is only for qualified or accredited investors. But there is an effort, I think, slowly to redirect the funds towards the Western side of the divide. And it makes sense because this is where the scarcity is, right? China is oversupplied with this material. We are undersupplied. So it does make sense to invest outside of China.
I want to just mention it now. We still have another 15 minutes or more left, but show your book again to everybody. Just sort of hold it up and then tell us where we can get it. What's the best place? Is it at Amazon, or where should we be looking?
Yeah, so Mineral War, China's Quest for Weapons of Mineral Destruction. It is available on Amazon in every country that has Amazon. It is also available by definition all of bookstores because Ingram Spark holds it as a wholesale. It doesn't mean that you can walk into Barnes and Noble or Strand and find it. You might need to ask them to actually deliver it for you. But it's widely available. And what I go there into is actually the history of this, how this dependency has developed over a longer period of time, because my strong belief is that we cannot actually attempt at solving this problem without understanding how we got here in the first place. And not everything is just China's fault. Let's face it, there is a deficiency in policymaking and regulatory framework and so on that pushed out much of this industry. There is the greed of the capital markets that looked mostly at labor arbitrage and external negative externality arbitrage that moved very quickly all the metal business out of our borders. So there are a lot of culprits historically on the western side of the divide as well. The reality is this is where we are, and so I think the book does a decent job, I'm told, explaining why this happened specifically in this sector. And by the way, I finished the book saying there should be other books like this about pharmaceuticals. Why are pharmaceuticals controlled? The API is controlled by China, right? Or port infrastructure, or container business, and so many other facets of life which are critical and belong to critical infrastructure. So I hope other people write other books called, I don't know, Container War or API War and so on.
On that bent, that sort of topic, do we as a country need to continue to try to protect Taiwan from being taken, or is that a foregone conclusion? And what about their situation?
Yeah, so I go to Taiwan often for family reasons and enjoy this country a lot. It's a country very much like ours, free, democratic. The tradition is not of common law, but of German civil law. That's the same for Taiwan and South Korea, which used to be colonies of Japan, and Japan introduced that German legal system into East Asia. And so to this day, those three countries function like this. So very sort of institutionally Western, even though culturally Eastern. Now, what you're referring to, of course, is the main concern for all of us, ahead of what would be a third world war, is the fact that we are just so dependent on what happens in the Hsinchu Science Park. Hsinchu, the New Bamboo, it's the name of the city, not far away from Taipei, where the most advanced logic chips are made. Of course, without access to this production, we're going to be set back by about 20 years technologically. The last thing you want is for communists to control that production. Obviously, there are other issues, of course, not related to technology. The most important is our own security. I always compare this in the discussion to Ukraine. Between Ukraine and the United States, there's still Germany and Netherlands and Belgium and France, and then a lot of fish. Unfortunately, between Taiwan and us, there's only fish. And so it's very, very easy if Taiwan is lost for the People's Liberation Navy to operate in deep Pacific. And Taiwan happens to be in this seismic area like Japan, sort of this very shallow waters to the west, so between Taiwan and the PRC, and very deep waters to the east. Extremely dangerous if we were to lose control over Western Pacific. And it's a democracy. And it's a free country, and it's our ally, and so-called non-NATO ally, right on the list you can find in Wikipedia what are the countries that are our major non-NATO allies. So it is in our interest. It is in Japan's interest. Japan would be existentially threatened by a loss of Taiwan, and I don't want even to think what it would mean potentially if Japan and South Korea were lost to the Western alliance, which would be sort of a natural domino, if not kinetically, then politically, if Taiwan was lost. So we would strike a very, very lonely position following that. Not to mention, of course, the eroding trust in U.S., if not hegemony, so at least offshore balancing that should be in place in East Asia, because it's just the most energetic and the most mobilized economic part of the world. So many reasons for that, in addition, of course, to the freedom of those 24 million 3 people there, and very lovely people with great food.
As one area of the world that we haven't discussed here at all, and yet it's what we hear about more frequently than maybe any other right now, is the Middle East, and particularly Iran and that area. Is there on the mineral side, are there any is there anything that's there that we could either benefit from if we had some solidity in that area or not, and even and so on?
It's an interesting question. I actually deal with this a lot on my own podcast, if someone's interested, entitled Tyranny Today. Tyranny Today. It's just some broader geoeconomic issues, and then of course factors in the situation in the Persian Gulf as well. So the most important impact that this conflict has had on the mineral side, as opposed to oil and gas and fertilizer side, was the production of sulfur and sulfuric acid, because it's just so critical for the fabrication of whether it's copper cathodes or nickel or rare earths or cobalt and many other ingredients into the broader metallurgical universe. And so this was an immediate impact. Iran itself is an important mining country. It's a huge country. It's part of a Tethyan belt. Tethyan belt is the amazing geological phenomenon that spreads from Bulgaria all the way to Burma, believe it or not. And Iran is part of that. I'm fortunate enough to have visited the country, and it has a lot of very interesting deposits, including copper and iron and lithium and some other critical minerals as well. Of course, it hasn't been available to Western investors for decades, and whatever Western investors did before 1979 was not necessarily very prospective or sustainable. Iran, these products generally are part of this other value chain. So let's call it broadly Chinese value chain. Likewise, the Iranian oil mostly was sold to China as well. This is not always the case with sanctioned nations. I give a counter example of North Korea. North Korea is, for example, one of the very important producers of tungsten, a critical mineral. And believe it or not, out of different sanction packages that North Korea has gone through in the last 30 years because of its non-compliance with NPT and then its exit from NPT, tungsten exports are not sanctioned. So tungsten, a critical mineral, has been the main source of hard currency inflows for North Korea, at least until recently. Now they have many more options, sort of balancing between Russia and China. So yes, there are minerals there. Whether they will be ever accessible for Western investors, I don't know. The situation is very unstable, and the problem is unfinished. What worries me more is that the Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz, the situation of Strait of Hormuz, and the constraints on flows of crude and refined products, and China's reaction to this. That is the massive stockpiling. Last year, China had almost 3 times as large a stockpile of oil, crude oil, as we had in our strategic reserves. That allowed them to draw on that stockpile for the first, say, 2 months of this conflict, and essentially they would have an ability at this rate to maybe survive 2 more years. So the entire dream of a Malacca dilemma for China, that we're going to somehow block the Malacca dilemma in case of, say, Taiwan contingency, because it's comfortable for the US Navy, it's far away from the A2AD, so anti-access area denial strategy that China has on its coastline. It's maybe not completely out of the window, but it's under a question mark. So most recent podcast that I have on that issue, I entitled, "Did Hormuz kill Malacca?" Unfortunately, there are some indications that maybe it has. So it's a broader issue than just minerals, of course, but the mineral market was destabilized a little bit. And if anything, I mentioned sulfur. Another metal was aluminum. And why? Because the GCC countries, the Gulf countries, many of them are significant producers of aluminum. This was one of the first sectors that they diversified into away from oil and gas, given how important the electricity prices are for smelting, aluminum smelting. as people say, it's just frozen electricity.
So we're about 6 minutes or so from the top of the hour. I want to completely change gears here. What about outer space? What about minerals and Elon Musk's? I know what his thoughts are there, and what could we get from the moon or from Mars or anywhere else from something, and if we started to think that way.
Yeah, so there are opportunities in certain types of meteorites that have significant components with nickel, cobalt, manganese. It's a little bit like the deep sea mining, similar elements available there. The moon itself, I think most interesting area of the moon itself is the southern pole of the moon. Russians and Chinese cooperate in this area. Of course, with Artemis, we are trying to leapfrog that effort, and the southern pole would be important because it potentially is also a stationing base for further exploration further into the space. You just don't need to have such a massive power because the gravity is so much lower to start from that area. But the problem is that the Chinese and Russians explored there already. And the other issue is you have to learn how to land. This is a very mountainous area covered with anorthosite. Anorthosite is precisely that sort of mineral that covers the mountainous parts of the moon, very, very tall mountains there. If it's interesting because in the shaded areas, permanently shaded areas, there's water, ice essentially, but that means water, but that means hydrogen for power and oxygen for survival. And anorthosite, NASA needs a lot of anorthosite to learn how to land those Artemis artifacts on that surface. Luckily enough, there are 2 mines of anorthosite that could potentially provide this on our planet. One is in Norway, and another one, guess what? It's in Greenland. Back to the Greenland question, I'm sure sometimes brought up. There are only 2 operating mines in Greenland. One is a gold mine and one is an anorthosite mine. So here we go. But that's not the reason why Greenland's important for the United States and Canada, by the way.
Isn't it interesting how much broader all of this is than probably a lot of us think? So again, what final thoughts here? What would you like to leave us with in the next several minutes?
Yeah, just if you're interested in this topic, I'll provide with a link to my weekly commentary about critical minerals, which runs on our website, hidden somewhere, probably not so easily visible here on these slides. There is my personal podcast that I can share, and of course share the Amazon link for the book. I strongly encourage people to pay more attention to this. There is a thread between this moon story, the Taiwan story, and whatever we're trying to dig around different parts of the world. It's not all conspiracy theory. Sometimes it's unfortunately conspiracy reality, but we have to conspire together to actually rebuild this thing. And I hope that we'll actually find a solution with our allies, some of whom are quite advanced. Japan is advanced in deep sea mining research. France is advanced in solvent extraction for rare earths. So if we stick together with our allies, so we will be successful.
Yeah, you mentioned just twice deep sea. Is there some things way down in the sea that we can still look at mineral wise?
Yeah, there is, but it's difficult to extract and currently not yet economic, although, the technology for these things is changing really fast. I always say that during eras of conflict, and we are living a period of conflict, probably will live periods of conflict for many years to come, but Ukraine has shown with their underwater drones that technology can really advance with sometimes feedback loops of 6-8 weeks. So yes, there's going to be more access to underwater resources. Some of them are deep sea, so not necessarily for precisely those type of drones, but I strongly recommend people who are interested to follow what Japan is doing in it, because Japan is not constrained by international agreements on that. They are doing this in their own economic zone. Norway is another advanced country. We have deployed some resources for that as well. We have a significant exclusive economic zone in the Pacific. These are mostly what we call manganese nodules. that tend to be clusters of different materials. There are some cobalt crusts. There are massive sulfides in Southwest Pacific and parts of the Indian Ocean. There are phosphates available near New Zealand. But right now, in terms of the actual CapEx and OpEx, so operating costs and capital costs spent for these resources, it's not competitive against normal land-based exploration and development, but it will change.
Well, this has been awesome, and I knew we'd enjoy it. Thank you to the audience for your great thoughts and questions. We will put the chat out there for everyone. This will be a replay in about 2 days that will be available, and we get so many more people that watch our replays than watch live, so please know that that's the case. Tomasz, if you don't mind, I'll probably personally stay in touch, and maybe I'm going to get your book, and I want to be able to be a little more intelligent to talk about this issue in general. So thank you so much. We appreciate it. Mark, thank you for helping put all this together. And audience, thank you.